Hey everyone, afternoon. It's really nice to meet you all today. I'm going to do a quick sound check and a visual check here in 1 second. Can someone provide a visual update that you can see that slide? Thank you. And I'm assuming you're hearing me because you gave that visual cue. So thanks. Folks, really nice to be here. These are some of the moments I really enjoy and cherish, and that force me to kind of slow down and frankly force me to process things I've been thinking about intentionally, things I've been thinking about subconsciously. And so Diego, thank you very much for the invite. Very quick introduction because I really want to get into the substance of the content here with you all. My name's Corey Ide. I live in Los Angeles. Had spent a few years in Washington, D.C., but mostly consider myself a Californian in terms of geography, and that being kind of attached to a lot of, I don't think about identity a lot, but that is part of, I suppose, that makes up some of my identity. I've spent about 16 years in this broader space, working domestically and internationally before disasters, during and after. And I spent 11 years of that time with the American Red Cross, where I typically think I professionally grew up in that organization. Many individuals have had the experience of finding their first job with the American Red Cross, and it's baptism by fire, meaning you're immediately thrown into something way over your head. You don't necessarily have the skills or the training, nor even the mental plasticity yet to navigate, and you are forced to support people that have been evacuated in the middle of the night, perhaps family members that have been hospitalized because of some reason or another, working with community organizations, as Michael indicated, of, well, hey, it's the middle of the night, you still have to get that school gymnasium open to provide a safe place to shelter, or hey, you're still trying to help people get into a hotel for the night, but those agreements that you put in place are over a year old. What do you do? It's very quick. So I spent a number of years working in general kind of operational management capacity with the Red Cross. Spent the last 4 years with the American Red Cross in Washington, D.C., overseeing their disaster recovery portfolio of services. And so a lot of what Michael referenced today is a lot of the reference points that I have with working with National VOAD members on any given moment, any given year, putting about $50 million worth of financial assistance into the hands of individuals that are affected by disaster, including the casework or case management services, which is helping those families get connected to other organizations like Michael's or others to really try to wrap as many resources around those individuals and families as possible, because disasters are overwhelming and recovery is even more overwhelming. And spent about 4 years right after that, took kind of a risk, joined a startup nonprofit called Team Rubicon, as Michael gave that overview. I'm not a veteran, which makes me one of the little bit of an oddity there, but I was brought in to help kind of grow and mature the organization. So I oversaw program development, which was really kind of standardizing and professionalizing the services they offered to people affected by disaster internationally and domestically, but also expanding into new services and new programs. And so we launched about a half a dozen different services in about 4 years, worked really closely with some of the big international NGOs and the UN, navigating a bunch of stuff. And then I think, Diego, to your point, that 1 year reference of I'm doing something different. A year ago, I was reached out by a large consulting firm to see if I could help craft a consulting practice to support state and local governments and nonprofits invest in resilience ahead of, during, and after disaster, meaning we're living in historic times. The rate of disruption has never been this, or we've never experienced this rate of disruption, devastation, trauma, and we don't have any more time to dally. We have to start making really important investments now. Fortunately, it happens to coincide with historic financial investment that's happening in communities around the world. So last thing about me, been married almost 20 years with my wife. She's the reason I've been able to do what I've done, and have 3 little kids, 11-year-old girl, 8-year-old girl, and a 5-year-old boy. So that's kind of the overview of who I am in hopefully like 2 minutes. So let's jump into this, the long view of emergent organizations and networks. So if I'm tracking with you all, you've been working through the semester as a task force, working through a heck of a lot of information and a heck of a lot of context to try to figure out like how you're navigating a potential disaster or a disaster. What I'd like you to think about for the next few minutes is if you've just completed that operational period. So you're on your way back, you're driving back to your hotel room or your home if the disaster is in your hometown. Perhaps you're listening to a podcast, maybe you're off the shift, but you're grabbing a quick cup of coffee with a couple of colleagues and they're talking and unpacking things together. And so that's kind of the context I want us all to kind of put ourselves in. There's nothing immediately pressing for the next 15, 18 minutes or so. And we're in a little bit more of like a reflective state, if that makes sense. And hopefully this provides some framing to us, some considerations on how to anticipate and be prepared to initiate perhaps even an emergent organization yourself or to engage with one. So we've got 3 parts today, but that's kind of a lie because we're just going to address the first 2. We don't have time to address the networks as I was really reflecting on time. So we're going to briefly kind of center ourselves around some definitions and a mindset, and then jump into a little bit of an overview of emergent organizations and what does that mean. So I'm kind of a words guy. Words are important to me. People's words are important to me, and common understanding of language is really important during times of disaster or interruption. So let's frame this for a minute. So emergent is an adjective, and Oxford frames it pretty succinctly, right? It's on the left-hand side there. But if anyone knows me a little bit, I'm not a succinct person. I really struggle with being succinct. And so I really kind of like Merriam-Webster's definition, right? There's like visceral language here. Arising unexpectedly. There's a call to action, and not just action, but a prompt action. There's this feeling of it's rising out of something. It's arising naturally. Really interesting language, right? This is just a natural outflow. When it's newly formed, or it's prominent, meaning like I think of prominent as something that has to be addressed, right? If anyone lived in New York, followed the news, or perhaps engaged with it, you know, Occupy Sandy, following Hurricane Sandy, was something that had to be dealt with. It wasn't disappearing. It wasn't going out of, it wasn't leaving, right? Occupy Sandy was the outgrowth of Occupy Wall Street, and it was prominent, even if it was messy, it was startup-ish, and for folks that are used to command and control, mostly emergency managers and veterans, right? There was not a command and control, right? There was no individual that was necessarily leading Hurricane Sandy. So I love that language of like prominent. So let's continue for just a quick minute. We should start to set our mindset that emergent organizations are always going to appear. It's not something that we should try to mitigate against. It's not something that we should push out. And I don't think there's folks in this call that would probably be of that mindset, but sometimes there are. And sometimes there's folks of mindset that say, we've got this handled. We don't need another person here. We don't need another organization that we have to manage and think through dynamics and politics and all that stuff. And I love, love, love this framing from Rebecca Solnit. So I'm just going to stop talking for a second and ask everyone to read that. So Rebecca Solnit flips on its head this idea of disaster, right? Meaning, and she's not trying to say it's this like, not that it comes without stress and hardship and trauma, but what if it's actually this really, really, really powerful tool that kind of like unlocks our normal day-to-day kind of malaise that we often live our lives in, and sometimes our communities live our lives in, especially folks with resources and privilege can often align to, right? meaning, hey, things are what they are. We just navigate our lives, and sometimes we don't question. And right now we're going through this massive reckoning that I would offer over the last 2 years of COVID, where we've got this dramatic transformation of people saying, I don't want to continue to do the jobs I've done. I don't want to continue to live in the place I've lived. I don't want to continue to commute 3 hours a day like I've had to commute. And there's this wrestling with the system that existed before and the expectation, and the system and expectations that are evolving today. And Rebecca Solnit's language here is rooted in sociologists and some disaster studies scholars that I'm sure Diego could school me on from the early or the mid part of the 20th century. But I love her visceral language, and it sets the precedent for us to think, or it sets the stage rather, for us to think about emergent organizations. So again, we're going to go back in history for just a quick minute. Anyone know who this dapper gent is? Heads shaking, any head nodding? Nope, head shaking all the way around. Okay, so this dapper gent, he's a Swiss gentleman by the name of Henri Dunant. He was born in 1828 into a wealthy family. He cut his teeth in business and organizing the foundations of the YMCA movement, something that I think often folks that are familiar with Henri Dunant, we forget to reference to who he was. He was a businessman. He was seeking out Napoleon III for business during time of armed conflict, during times of war. Napoleon was over the Franco-Sardinian forces fighting the Austrians in what today we would think of as northern Italy. There were 300,000 soldiers that were facing off in straight lines. So think back to a movie like Braveheart or any of those other war movies where you literally have soldiers just facing off to each other and then just getting closer and closer and closer until it's absolute atrocity upon absolute atrocity, right? The most barbaric of actions that can happen face to face. And what he found himself, though, was as he was traveling through what was a fresh battle zone, was that this had just concluded in this town of Solferino. And he was aghast at the suffering of the soldiers that were left to die. So at this moment in time, there was not an expectation that there would be care and comfort and dignity protection of those soldiers that were wounded and left to die. And he was motivated by something. He was motivated to act. And he mobilized villagers from around surrounding villages to provide aid and comfort. And we don't often read things aloud, so we're going to kind of go old school here real quick, and I have a paragraph just to read to you from his memoir, A Memory of Solferino. The moral sense of the importance of human life, the humane desire to lighten a little the torments of all these poor wretches, or restore their shattered courage, the furious and relentless activity which a man summons up at such moments, all these combine to create a kind of energy which gives one a positive craving to relieve as many as one can. There is no more grieving at the multiple scenes of this fearful and solemn tragedy. There is an indifference as one passes even before the most frightfully disfigured corpses. There's something akin to cold calculation in the face of horrors, yet more ghastly than those here described, and which this pen absolutely declines to set down. But when you feel sometimes that your heart is suddenly breaking, it's as if you were stricken all at once with a sense of bitter, irresistible sadness because of some simple incident, some isolated happening, some small unexpected detail which strikes closer to the soul, seizing on all of our sympathies and shaking all the most sensitive fibers out of our being, right? It's a hearkening to what Rebecca Solnit described as that motivation to move and to act, and yet the sensitivities of day-to-day life are no more, right? This is visceral, this is real, you are forced to act. Folks familiar with chat falls? Open up the chat feature. If you don't have the chat feature, get ready to drop your comments real quick and we'll quickly see a bunch of responses. So I would love everyone to participate if possible. So as we think about most of the major actors today in the domestic disaster relief space, and Michael touched on many of them, or in the international humanitarian space, many of these all started as emergent organizations. Go ahead and drop an idea of who you would consider was an emergent organization sometime post 1859. We'll take 15 seconds. And Diego, am I tracking with, I've got about 8 minutes left. Is that right?
No, you have more. We can go until 3:10, 3:05.
All right, probably no more than 12 then. All right, let's see. Red Cross, Salvation Army, American Red Cross, others, other organizations. Red Cross, Team Rubicon, any others? Catholic Charities, cool. Keep them coming, keep them coming. So as we think about this origin story of emergence in this timeline, I think it's important to help us also think about, what are the drivers behind why there's this need for emergence, right? This emergent organization, this emergent movement of people to solve some need that is identified. I give you just a handful of examples, and there should be a whole bunch of asterisks on this because I could irritate a whole lot of people that I didn't include dozens and dozens and dozens of other organizations, but just a handful of very prominent and or new organizations. So Henri Dunant's work ultimately led to the creation of the International Community of the Red Cross, which is the custodian of the Geneva Conventions, right? Anyone following the war in Ukraine today should be very real in understanding that international humanitarian law and war crimes are very material, and we have to keep investing in international humanitarian law because there's things that are happening today reportedly that would be violations or are violations of that. And that's one of the key roles the ICRC has. But he also set in motion the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, as well as the national societies. So think Cruz Roja in Mexico or the Canadian Red Cross just north of us. You can also continue to see that although the Red Cross often is seen, or the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is largely seen as kind of the origin of the humanitarian movement or even the disaster relief space, we see kind of breakages from that. Médecins Sans Frontières was effectively kind of a draft off of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement after concerns of what they considered was a need or a right to testify to atrocities that were being committed. And there was concern at the origin of their work in West Africa that the principle of neutrality was being used to not communicate atrocities and to hold sides of conflicts accountable. So we see this kind of drafting off of what today is one of the most prominent humanitarian organizations in the world. We can also even see just in the last 10 plus years, organizations like Team Rubicon, right, did exactly what they said, what textbook and academics say you don't do, right, is self-deploy to an event, right? You had veterans that were sitting on couches that had millions and millions of dollars of American taxpayers invested in them with skills and experience and capabilities, sitting on couches watching one of the world's worst earthquakes ever hit an urban environment, and they self-deployed to provide some type of medical aid, right? We see chefs, celebrity chefs now at the forefront of one of the core purposes and services of what the Red Cross mission had been, and what many of the faith-based organizations had been, which is providing food, right? I think Michael spoke to the Southern Baptists or the Salvation Army, and all of a sudden you have this emergent actor in the last 10 years or so, World Central Kitchen, with a novel concept, which is, hey, let's resource and mobilize all the restaurants in the affected area. Kind of an ode to Michael's question or prompt of saying, maybe there are more resources in an affected area, and maybe it's just there needs to be an inject of some resources. Maybe that's cash, maybe that's commodities, what that might be. Get ready for one more chat fall, and we're going to wrap up here in just a second. I think it's also important to note, really quick point. I have mutual aid here as kind of the foundation of saying mutual aid has always existed, right? Mutual aid is that idea of individual helping individual or neighbors pooling resources to be able to address a common need. mutual aid in the last handful of years has started to make major progress in terms of like pop culture reference and journalism and all sorts of different things, which we don't have the time to unpack here. And rightly so, it's getting a lot of resources and credit. That said, it's always been the epitome of the emergent organization, right? Individuals coming together, trying to leverage the resources that they have to support a neighbor or to support someone across town. And that part 3, which we're not going to get into today, which is, wow, like talk about mutual aid on fire with new technologies and new network capabilities, which is what we're seeing play out through COVID and through other disasters. Okay, so next chat fall real quick. I think it's important to note I've only mostly focused on emergent organizations that are providing some sort of service, right? Or we typically think of that as service delivery. So what do we think are the primary drivers why a new organization or an emergent organization would need to jump into the mix and provide service and provide some type of assistance? Really quick, chat fault, whatever that first thought is, comes to mind. Why do we think there's a need? What's the driver for someone to come in, Jose Andreas, to say, hey, I want to mobilize the kitchens? Or a team Rubicon saying, let's provide emergency medical aid, even though there's a huge system of emergency medical that was descending upon Port-au-Prince at that time. They have capabilities that they see that's lacking in the response. Okay, appreciate that. Availability of resources, they see a vacuum. They're attempting to address it. Anyone else? People's innate willingness and interest to help. Yep, I'll harken back to Solnit's framing as well as Henri Dunant's. How about coordination? Like, what would be the driver for a new organization to come in to say, hey, we need to step in to support coordination? It can be a little bit more abstract, but it's, you know, Diego, Michael, I mean, how much of the work have we, the three of us, collectively done over the years, which is literally just the coordination of people, resources, timing, etc. They experienced a lack of coordination. Others? Confusion. They see a need or a hole in the established system. Love it. All right. Feel free to drop suggestions for fundraising or advocacy as well. Couple musings from me. These are not exclusive. I should probably have an asterisk here again because it probably irritates some people that are looking for perhaps more comprehensive answers to this, but a couple directly from my experience and the academic literature I'm familiar with. From a service delivery perspective, it's often because there are needs that are unaddressed, like pockets of communities. Perhaps those are demographic-based pockets, meaning it's a different ethnicity or a different race group or a different income level group or a different, high, perhaps it's a conglomerate of those, but it's a highly vulnerable community from a social vulnerability construct, right? Coordination, the Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Sandy rather is a good example of that, where all of a sudden they were coming in doing almost like micro coordination off of some of the really large organizations like the American Red Cross or other national VOAD members, like movement of those resources to the last mile of delivery. From a fundraising perspective, I think one of the perhaps most interesting ways to think about this is if there's opportunity to raise different funds, right? Funds that wouldn't have been raised, say, by some of the traditional organizations or the stalwarts, and they're unlocking resources in a different way, right? We see this in perhaps different generational expectations of how their donations are used, perhaps some preferences around effectiveness of their funds. You can see organizations like Give Well, really looking at efficacy of the funds that they raise and move to organizations. And this last one, from an advocacy perspective, maybe there's additional attention that has to be raised or leveraged to address needs. Often we see these, in communities that structurally have not been set to seize as much of the resources in times of disasters. We're going to wrap up here, I think, in just 1 second. And so when I think about, what are the organizations that are emerging today that will endure, right? There's lots of organizations that come and go. And are some of the logos and the images here examples of organizations that are going to, in the next 10 or 20 years, when one of you's facilitating this course, you're using these examples as the continuation of that first timeline, right? The major organizations, the substantive organizations that command, respect and dignity and privilege and all these other things that they attempt to be able to deliver. And yet today, these organizations here definitely don't have the street cred. Excuse me, they have the street cred in many ways. They don't have the name recognition. They definitely don't have the donor pull that some of the large organizations do. Sometimes these organizations are, again, working at those like micro levels, right? Literally based, West Street Recovery origin was literally like a micro neighborhood in Houston following Hurricane Harvey. Do some incredible advocacy work, not to mention bringing people back into their homes, but telling the story of recovery in different ways. Or Imagine Waterworks being really vocal, right? Being a fundraiser, being a service delivery organization, and being an advocate, and perhaps even coordination. So that's an example of one that would hit kind of like all 4 of those characteristics. Following Hurricane Laura, and now mobilizing to communities affected by the tornado that hit the lower 9th Ward in New Orleans just a couple of days ago. And then obviously the mutual aid that will continue. Perhaps it gets more formalized in some examples. Perhaps it stays decentralized. Who the heck knows? Many of you will be the drivers of that. So with that, just a couple of resources to get in touch with me. Please reach out if I can ever be of help. Sometimes I'm not always the fastest on response, but I typically always will get back. And if for some reason I don't, really thick skin, so feel free to ping me again if I can be of help. With that, Diego, back to you.